Welcome everyone to our 2023 fall webinar series. Before we begin, I'll just say a few housekeeping notes for those who haven't been on. If you do have any questions, you may type them into the question box at the bottom right-hand side of the control panel, and we can answer those questions throughout the presentation today. Anything you type into the question box, only the organizers of the webinar will be able to see. If you type anything into the chat box, anyone will be able to see that. Our webinar today is scheduled to wrap up by 1 o'clock. And if we run out of time to answer questions, we can always ask our presenter to follow up with you by email. A link to the recorded webinar will be sent out to everyone who was registered and will be posted to our website. The email containing the link to the recording will be sent out about 24 hours after the webinar wraps up today. At the end of this session, you will be prompted to complete a short survey. Your feedback is really important for planning future events, so please consider filling that out. And I will now turn the webinar over to Natasha, who's our facilitator for this session.
Thanks, Chelsea. Hey everyone, and welcome to the third session of the 2023 Fall Webinar Series. Like Chelsea mentioned, my name is Natasha Wilkie, and I'm a livestock and feed extension specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture based out of Weyburn. So far in the southeast corner, I'll be facilitating the webinar today. And today's webinar is on farm transition planning, and we have Val Panko joining us. And so Val currently delivers virtual business and transition support with Farm Credit Canada, or FCC, as lots of us know it, as a business advisor. Her prior experience includes the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture, so she was once with us as a farm business management specialist, many years as an ag lender and credit adjudicator, as well as beginning her career in the grain industry. She grew up on a cattle operation in southern Saskatchewan and holds a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture. She was one of the first members of the newly formed FCC advisory team and helped to create and develop the original and now expanded advisory service. So at this time, I'd like to turn the webinar over to you, Val. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. I am going to start sharing. Can everybody see that? Yes? Okay, good. Wonderful. Thanks again, Natasha, for the introduction and for the invite to speak today. So I appreciate that. Hi, everybody. Yes, I am, in fact, a business advisor with FCC, and I think I'll explain a little bit more on what that is and how I came to be in that role first before we get into the real meat of the presentation. So I came back to FCC about 6 years ago from the Ministry of Ag, and it was really intentional to look at starting to pilot this new service that we were looking to build. So it was pretty much, I would say, a little bit of an idea or a light bulb at the time we got back, and so it was really just boots on the ground piloting. We weren't sure what it would look like. FCC had been hearing for a long time that their customers could use some support in navigating transition, because it is a challenging topic and it can be overwhelming. So they thought, okay, well, how could we pilot this? And so it was myself and another person, and we started in Saskatchewan. We kind of, figured it out as things went. So it was a little bit of a rodeo, but good times were had by all. And over the last few years, I'd like to say it's gotten very successful, because we've actually expanded the team. There's now advisory support all across Canada. There's at least one and maybe two advisors per province. So that's worked out really well. And now to talk a little bit about what we did. So we aren't technical. I'm not an accountant or a lawyer. I didn't come to do tax planning, and so that's not where my expertise lies. And FCC didn't want to get involved in that. It was really more FCC has a mandate to the federal government to help improve the business of agriculture. So it's not tied to our lending business. I don't lend money. I'm in a totally different department from that. I have no lending authorities. And yeah, it's this idea to help people through this. So it's been developed as a free service for our customers and non-customers. You don't have to be somebody who borrows money from FCC to access that. And the idea behind it is, I like to describe it as a bit of a pre-transition conversation. So it's kind of this gap between, you maybe have a farm operation, you're going to transition, but you haven't taken a lot of steps yet with maybe your accountant and lawyer to get the ball rolling. So I look at those as kind of the certainly critical pieces to a transition, but a little bit more of the technical and of the implementation piece. But how do you decide what you want to do with the accountant and the lawyer? And I like to think that that's what we focus on. So a lot of times I think the value that I can bring is having done it with, having sat side by side through a lot of these family transitions, I can provide some options or things to think about, considerations. They might be things that went really well with an operation like yours or a family like yours. And then conversely, things to watch out for, right? Things where maybe the wheels fell off. So be careful of this or be cautious using these kinds of things. So that's, I think, a big part of what we can do, but also even the intentional conversation that I think this provides. I know a lot of the families that I sit with, the history of transition conversation in their family has been limited to, maybe we briefly talked about it, we were driving somewhere, or there's some comments made over a meal at one time or another. And the problem with that is you don't get everybody on the same page. And a bigger problem with that is sometimes some of those flip comments that are made can be misinterpreted or misunderstood. And then you've got people that really don't know what's going on and are nervous or scared of what they think is going to happen. So having those intentional conversations where all the right people are in on the conversation, and that might be in a group setting altogether, or it might be individually. I meet with people individually as well to help facilitate that conversation. So that's the idea behind that. And again, we focus on, I like to describe it as the what versus the how. So we kind of are a bridge to the professionals where they would certainly help you with the how, and they are awesome at it, and you would absolutely need them as part of your transition plan. But I like to think, well, what about the what and why? Why are you doing it? What's your goals? What's your objectives? What are you going to tell those lawyers and accountants when you sit in front of them? And I think sitting down and having these conversations where we kind of define that end result, and I'd like to think that for the benefit of those technical advisors, that can facilitate the whole process. There's always a lot of attention around tax if you start there, but you'll find out through my presentation there's lots more to focus on than just the tax. So that'll be a bit of a theme. Tax is important. I'm not gonna say otherwise, but it is certainly something to consider there. Okay, so let's go on to the first slide. You might notice there's going to be a theme. There's going to be some stuck in the mud situations that maybe might make you happy that you're sitting watching this today and you're not like these guys. The purpose of my presentation is to help build some awareness around what kinds of things often go wrong in transitions, what kind of challenges that families face, and I'll give you some level on how to address them. Again, I'm not a super good tax accountant or anything, so there'll be some of those that, those will be where the solutions lie with those professional advisors, but we'll talk about that. What else? We want to make sure that when you see this, it's really building awareness. Like, you're not the only person that's gone through this. So I think if it's made my presentation, it's certainly common enough of a challenge or a hurdle that other people have addressed it, and there's probably some method or some approach to address that. And so you're not on your own. You are not the only one that's faced this. And I'm not going to say that they can all be fixed with a silver bullet, but certainly there are ways to address them, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so I heard this quote last week and I really like it, so I added it to my presentation. Plans are nothing, planning is everything. So Dwight Eisenhower said that. And apparently he said it in the context of battle or war or something along those lines, which I don't like that comparison to transition, but I think it is very appropriate for the topic that I'm talking about. So the plan, I think, it's symbolic. It's represented in these pictures. The plan can go wrong. The plan does go wrong. But the planning allows everybody to understand that ultimate objective and goals so that you can adjust the plan and decide what to do when the plan fails, because it will. And things like this are going to happen. Like I said, the symbolism of getting stuck, it's just a little too appropriate for my liking. So anyway, let's talk about that. We're going to talk today about the kinds of things we can do in conversations and the planning that we can get started to maybe help alleviate some of those stuck in the mud situations. So where do we start? That's a big hurdle for people. A lot of times that big challenge of getting going, getting the wheels off the ground is the first big hurdle. So one of the first things, why might you need to know your income needs in retirement? So to me, it's a pretty big piece of the puzzle. First off, the next generation that's coming in, so your successor will certainly need to know that in order to help them plan to go forward. I find it's actually easier to work backwards. So rather than focusing on how much you can take out of the farm to support your retirement, I would suggest and encourage people to look at it as figure out how much you need. So that way you're not, taking out too much from that farm you're not pulling too much equity out of that operation that might impact their ability to either operate or expand going forward. And it can give you an idea of your financial needs, so you can start planning around that. Some healthy conversation goes along with it. So really it's a budget, but I like to think that as you're building that budget, and I fully recognize it's a plan. Is it something that can be adjusted and should be? Absolutely. But if you don't start with anything, it's going to be tricky to plan around that. So developing that budget can help you kind of think and talk about what kind of lifestyle and what plans you want to make in retirement, because if you need to support those with money, you're going to need to talk about what kinds of things you're going to do. Now, what are some ways to do that? Because that's often the next challenge. People are like, well, we've been farming for so long, everything's in one pot. I really don't know if I can budget for just having personal needs. So one of the things, a budget, there's lots of software out there. FCC has a cost of living calculator on their website, so you're welcome to that. That's something that we have, and there's probably plenty of them around. I'm not going to dress it up. It's a budget calculator. However, the piece that I would add to that I think adds real value is seek out or look for some support from a financial planner or a wealth planner, an investment planner, whatever you want to call them. I use a financial planner at my chartered bank. Well, it's a free service provided by the bank. She's not paid by commission, so I don't feel super compelled to buy anything from them. But I do like it that's her full-time job, is supporting people in determining what are the sources of income in retirement, what are your expenses, what's your budget going to look like, and how are we going to meet those needs? How do we structure your investments to do that? Now, budgeting to me was just one step further away from that, and I know that that can sometimes help to figure out, okay, do I feel comfortable with the numbers that we've landed on? Next point, risk. How comfortable are you with it? So are you willing to transfer any assets at this point? Are you willing to be the banker in the situation if there's a vendor finance situation for your successor? Are you going to end up relying on that farm's profitability because that's the sole source of your retirement income? So those are all levels of risk that you may or may not be comfortable with, and it's important to kind of get clear on that before you get too far in, because that could change what you're willing to do depending on your risk tolerance. Viability and goals. Right away, this is a big one. Can the farm afford to support 2 or more families? So of course you in retirement, but then also that next generation that's coming in. And whose problem is this to solve? Is this solely the senior generation's problem? I don't think it is. Anyway, we'll talk about this later. I've got a whole slide further down in the presentation because it's a big one, but it is absolutely something that needs to be established and determined early so that you can build a plan around it. Now, the next generation, they're coming in, so obviously they're going to need to know those retirement needs, your income needs, so that they can plan around that. The viability aspect, is there going to be enough to support them as they come in to take over that operation? Is it what they planned? What is their vision for the farm, and does it match yours? That can be a bit of a sticking point, right? If the next generation comes in and they're going to take this farm in a completely different direction, are you on side with that? And so really having those conversations to figure that out and incorporate that next generation's thoughts and their plans is a really healthy way to get started on that. Okay. Now I've peppered a few just pictures only, no information on the slides. 1, to take a bit of a breather, and 2, because when I'm in a room full of farmers, they usually like them. So I hope that you'll enjoy them for a bit, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, when and how to start transferring assets. How long do you wait before you start transferring assets? A lot of producers get a little nervous and they feel like they can't transition. They get paralyzed by it because they worry that they can't transition anything until their debt is paid off. Or they can't start transitioning until they can't give up any acres or productive units, whatever that may be, like cattle. They can't give those things up, or a land base, because they need that income to cover their payments. So I get it. It's a reasonable concern, but it is it's absolutely possible to transition and include debt in that. So that certainly isn't something that takes it off the table. You can absolutely transfer debt along with an asset or along with an operation or a corporation. We're going to talk about that further down the road. If you've heard the term of estate freeze or share freeze, that's a method to transfer the entirety of a corporate entity to new shareholders. So the debt goes along with that. So it does not have to be fully paid down before you can get the ball rolling. So if that's what's holding you back, look into that, because there's more to be done. Now, this default beliefs, I want to address this for a second. This idea, and some people hold it, that if they've got a family farm corporation, that they have to add all the kids in as shareholders to that corporation, to their farm company. And that's the only way to do transition. Like, that's what they have to do. Now, it's a valid way. Absolutely seen lots of family farm companies that have that structure. They've got mom and dad as shareholders and then maybe 2 sons. I've seen it happen. But I will press pause on that and ask you to reflect and consider on that. Now, I like to talk about in terms of profit centers, so I'm going to explain what that is. Now, one profit center versus multiple profit centers. A profit center is a profitable unit. So if I'm a sole proprietor, I have one profit center. If I'm a company, I am one profit center. If I'm a company with several different shareholders, I am still one profit center. But if I am a company and my son is a sole proprietor and my other son has his own company and we operate together in a partnership or a joint venture or some other structure, that is 3 profit centers. Okay, so what I want people to pause and consider on that, having multiple profit centers allows something that one profit center doesn't. And that's something I find is kind of important. It's called financial independence. And so this is one of these things that I think will matter in addition to tax, in terms of the potential for conflict or struggle in the future. If you've got a structure that supports that financial independence versus financial dependence. So when you are 4 shareholders in one company, there are going to be decisions that need to be made. There's going to be purchasing, there's going to be withdrawals. Those are all things that make you dependent on your other shareholders. I say dependent, I mean, you're really zipped up in a sleeping bag together, right? You're down the road of doing business together. So it's really important that you consider how your structure might impact something like that feeling of financial independence and how that can impact your family and your relationships going forward. So that's why I like to pause on that one and just, again, there's no wrong way. There's no wrong way to structure yourselves, but just consider the consequences and the downstream effects that can have. Now, I also added in, I mentioned joint ventures and partnerships. I'm going to just mention that I see joint ventures being used a lot more frequently, probably even in the last 3 years than maybe I had before. Now, if anybody is not really clear on what that is, it's not a formal structure. It's more like an operating agreement. And it works really well in a transition situation because it's flexible and it's renewable. So you can go back and change it. You know, if you're trying to work mom and dad out slowly of the operation and work in the junior partners in slowly, you can adjust your joint venture accordingly to reflect that. And like I said, it does support those multiple profit centers. So I do see that being used a little bit more, and I'm a bit of a fan. Okay, another stuck in the mud situation. Let's go on to talk about releasing or sharing control. And I really just should have titled this control, because control can be a bit of a challenge and an issue when you're working through transition plans. I don't know if you guys know any 50 or 60-year-olds who are actually still the junior partners and don't own anything yet, or are not calling the shots because their 70 and 80-year-old parents are the ones that still own the assets and still in control of the business. So maybe you've heard that phrase, ruling from the grave. So not necessarily trying to encourage that. So what we want to talk about is, if it's a true transition, you've got to look at incorporating that next gen in and working together. And that doesn't just mean putting them to work, but including them in the management and control of that operation. So how do we do that? So we talked a little bit at the last slide on structure. And I like to consider that there's two ways to address this. So structure can provide, you can use it in ways that can kind of separate assets and ownership and insulate you a little bit and create that financial independence that we talked about. But if you choose a structure where you don't have that insulation or you don't have that separation, you're like, let's say you are all shareholders in one company, totally fine. You might want to rely more on something like a strategy. And in my mind, a strategy for how to protect yourselves and create a good working relationship lands with this idea of governance. So don't be too put off by the term. I know, I don't mean parliamentary procedure or anything like that. Governance for me, and this is my kind of technical definition of it, it's an agreed upon and established approach that creates rules, norms, processes, actions that are structured and sustainable that you can fall back on for your daily operations and any choices that you make that allow you to work together fairly and act in the best interest of the family and the business. So what does that mean? What does it look like? A lot of it's common sense. I heard this last week at the same conference where I heard the quote. A lot of it's common sense. But if you don't establish it and document it and put everybody on the same page about it, it's really easy to misinterpret this common sense and then plead ignorance. Oh, I didn't know we were going to do it that way. I didn't realize that that was how you expected it, and that's what establishing this governance can do. It can put these common sense things, put them out on the table. I like the idea of documenting it, but heck, even just a full-on conversation where people get on the same page and establish this. So these are the 4 areas that I like. I think it's a pretty wide swath when you consider them. So decision-making, compensation, conflict resolution, and communication. But if I had to categorize of all the conflicts and issues and let's say implosions of farms or families, they are going to fall under one of these categories. So if you can establish some guidelines around each of them to kind of protect that farm and get everybody on the same page, and this is the key, if everybody is involved in creating this governance. If you are a part of establishing it and building it, you're much more likely to lean into it and believe in it. And that's the point of creating and following that governance. Okay, that's that one. Now what about this last point? How can that junior generation get involved without necessarily taking on too much risk or sinking the farm? So something that I have seen people try, and it seems like it works well. I think it's a great action to take. Doing something like a trial period or trial acres to try out this transition idea and implement some change, and allowing that junior generation to have some skin in the game and a vested interest in it, right? So either that could look like renting some acres, that's fully their decision, from seeding to marketing, whatever it is that's what they want to do, or it can be a time frame. My mom and dad are gone to Arizona, or I don't know, take off, and there's a time frame that they are left in charge to do that. And I can't say this, how important this is enough, because it really is, it's this opportunity that they have to learn and to exercise their own control. And I think if we all, even if we look at it from the perspective of the senior generation, we all know how much we learned from our own decisions and our own mistakes and our own relative level of independence. So I think trying to find ways to support that, I think you're training your next generation as best you can. Okay, I'm going to pause again there for another ugly photo. Oh, there's a question. Go ahead.
Hi, Val. So there, just to let everyone know too, if you want to type questions in the question box, we can answer them throughout the presentation. And there isn't one in there, but I did have one. So with the governance, do you provide examples of what that governance wording could look like to your clients?
We can, yes, absolutely. Like now, again, my role is meant to be a little bit this in between. So I won't do the whole thing. It's like I won't write a transition plan, but absolutely. Some ideas on like compensation is a great one. How do you get clarity on how you're compensated if I come back to the farm this year, but then my younger brother comes back in 2 more years? Well, if you don't have a compensation guideline or some governance around that, sometimes they can look wildly different. And if it's wildly different, it's wildly unfair at some point, and somebody will notice. So yes, we can talk through what that might look like, and I can point you in the right direction. I will also say that even finding a good facilitator to walk you through establishing these, I mean, you decide what kind of rules you need, and you just get a facilitator that can kind of help you get to that end point if you're not comfortable maybe doing that yourself. Awesome. Any other ones? Good to go. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So I like to talk about risk management. I know I'm probably the only person on the planet that likes to do it, but I think it's a really appropriate time to talk about it when you are getting involved in a transition. Now, I used to lend money, and I'm involved in risk management that way. So I also say it's a good time to review it when you're borrowing money. It's a good time to review your contingency plans and risk management all the time, but certainly around transition. It's also, I like it because it's got a nice catchy, the 5 Ds, right? So the Ds refer to disasters that we are looking to try to mitigate. So I've got a list of them, and they're not in a particular order, although I do always make a joke because I have a colleague so when you are in this line of work, divorce and the topic of divorce comes up a lot. So it's a very, very primary concern of a lot of people. But I have a colleague who makes a joke that, you know, that sure, the divorce rate's bad. You know, I heard 40% recently, like that's a bad rate, right? But death rate, we're all 100%. We are all going to meet our maker. So the fact that this divorce rate gets a lot of airtime when sometimes it comes from the same families where you've got people that do not have current wills in place or wills at all in place. That's something that I look at and go, okay, I think we need to set our calibrate this properly, because definitely mitigating that risk of death is going to happen to everybody and nobody knows when. So obviously, I probably don't have to tell you, but one of the best ways to mitigate that particular risk is with a will. So I also encourage people to look at things like assigning a power of attorney or creating a healthcare directive to just kind of alleviate some of the stress that might fall on your loved ones if something were to happen to you. Another thing I'm going to say about this, I'm not going to get deep into estate planning, but I will say I think it's an important, no, it's a best practice. I'll put it that way. It's a best practice to communicate the contents of your will or your estate plan to your heirs, to your family. Keeping it a secret and blindsiding them, and I know that may not be your intent, but I will tell you as a spectator that has seen it, like any picture you've seen on here today, that pales in comparison to the drama and the chaos and the conflict that can happen in families where they get blindsided by some estate plans that they weren't aware of. Unspoken expectations are a killer in this particular part of our industry. So either, you know, you'll have family members that expected to be treated a certain way, or they expected another family member to be treated a certain way. But if you don't have those conversations and you don't know what's in that estate plan, it can absolutely become a challenge that that can destroy family relationships and never recover from them. So now I realize that I deal with people all the time that are like, you know, that's private, that's my business, and that's nobody's business but mine. And I respect that. I respect the sentiment behind that. I would just ask you to reflect on that and to consider, because again, having seen it, I once asked an estate litigator, like that was all he did is just litigate estate issues. And I said, how many times do people that you're doing business with know what were in the contents of the will? And he did this to me. He's like, 0. That's almost exclusively does not happen in his line of work. And I thought, that can't be a pattern that only I'm picking up on. So anyway, something to consider on that one. Let's move on to divorce, which I'm sure everybody, that's the most popular one, right? So everyone wants to hear about that one. So divorce, certainly a big risk, a big challenge, the potential for it to overcome when you're looking at a transition plan. I have seen senior partners, like the senior generation, outright stall any plans for transferring any assets, or maybe even talking about it, because they are so concerned that this relationship breakdown is going to happen to their junior partners that they do not want to risk, you know, that their family land falling into strangers' hands or anything along those lines. And I understand the concern and the angst that goes along with that. But if your transition doesn't move forward either, you can really find yourself in a tricky spot. So There's certainly some ways to handle this, and there are some that are quite heavy-handed, and I am going to leave that to the lawyers to discuss. I am going to talk about agreements. Now, you'll still have to discuss this with a lawyer, because this is, you can't create any kind of, prenup agreement, prenuptial cohabitation or interspousal agreements. They all need to be reviewed and created probably by a lawyer, but I'm going to talk about the value in them. One, I think that they promote a lot of good communication up front and let everybody know. If you can't tell, another theme of my presentation is transparency. So what agreements can do, whether they be before, so prenup, when you're living together, cohabitation, or after you're already married, what they can do is negotiate that relationship breakdown in advance, which can help you to protect or address any legacy land or gifts that you might have intended to stay out of that relationship. So I heard another good bit of advice, and it's like so common sense: negotiate these when you like each other, right? No kidding. So even something I've included, even an example of something like, what can that look like? Like, what are you going to say? But even including a provision such as, repayment over time, that can make a huge difference to the ability of that farm to withstand a relationship breakdown, versus, I'm not going to say a typical divorce agreement, but certainly there's divorce agreements where thou shalt pay X, how many millions of dollars on such and such a date, right? And those are the kinds of, that's not really agreement, that's the kind of statement that can really put a farm in a tough position, because as we all know, coming up with oodles of cash at one time is not always that easy. So having those, considering those agreements in advance and putting those in place beforehand when everybody gets along can be a really healthy best practice. Sorry about that. So yes, I encourage people to look at those before you actually get into the relationship breakdowns, because again, people don't buy fire insurance because they intend their house to burn down. And these kind of agreements can protect you in the same way. Okay, disability. Sorry about that. So this one I'm a little bit weaker on, disability and dementia, simply because insurance for farmers, it's prohibitive. It's a cost issue. It's very expensive. So one of the things that I like to encourage people to do around this topic is just discussing it, to even raise awareness, raise the level of awareness on, what happens if this happens to us as an operation, as a family, what's open to us, and then you're just not so ambushed by, and again, heaven forbid it actually happens, but having those discussions in advance can be a level of risk mitigation in themselves. So I'm a big fan of reviewing these and coming back and just raising that awareness in your operation. Now, departure. What to do how to discuss when you're getting into the operation, how to get in, how to get out. Exiting is, kind of what we're talking about here in the departure. If you are a corporation, there is often, maybe not often, there are times when to accompany the creation of that corporation, a unanimous shareholder agreement will have been created, and you may have one of those as part of your company. Now, often in that USA, for short, unanimous shareholder agreement, often they'll cover off how you can exit. So it might include, shotgun clauses, buy-sell agreements, whatever that looks like. So one thing I would say right away is, if you're part of a farm corporation and you don't have one of those, it might be worthwhile to consider looking at it. Now, if you are not a farm corporation, I don't see any reason why you can't create the same idea, mimic the same idea through governance, like we talked about in the last couple slides. So that there's absolutely talking about how you get into my operation, how you get out of the operation, what we do to when somebody expresses that. There's no reason why you can't cover that as a sole proprietor as well. Disagreement. I feel like I've chipped my hand too much, and you're probably going to realize that the answer to this one is probably lies in the governance slide, one back. And yes, you're right. I will tell a couple horror stories. I'm sure everybody has horror stories that you've seen of operations that you've seen implode, where it didn't even take divorce. It was conflict between maybe two brothers, or parents and child. There's all kinds of examples of it where that conflict could not be resolved and that relationship imploded, and the only winners are often the lawyers, because many times those relationships never recover. The families are still not speaking. So that's a healthy, in my view, a healthy encouragement to consider creating and establishing some of that governance to support communication and conflict resolution. It's one of my main four. What do you do when you have a conflict? How do you resolve this? And you talk about your process for that long before you're in that actual conflict. Okay, pause again, which is good because I want to drink. Okay, now we're going to get to the good one. I know I was going to get a question on this if I didn't put it in, so this is a big slide because this is a lot of questions on this. I'm going to start out by saying there is no such thing as a silver bullet to make a farm transition fair. And I'm concentrating on fair because we all accept that we're never going to make it equal when it's a farm, right? And so people think, okay, but we can make it fair. Yes, you probably can. But I want to know whose definition of fair you're going to use, because that's the challenge, right? That is the challenge with this fair versus equal. We can't make it equal, we can make it fair. So fair, we'll talk about this. There's some ways to address that, but consider that. Whose definition of fair? The farm child might have a different definition of fair than a non-farm child. So you might want to consider exploring that and incorporating that into your plan to address this. Now, what if the farming child sells out? I didn't include this in the departure from the risk last one because I thought it deserved its own speak. So we'll talk a little bit about this. So here's an example that I've seen, so you've got, let's say, you've got a farming son that wants to come back in transition, and a couple of non-farming siblings for that family. And everybody values the farm legacy, and they want to see this farming child step up and transition into the farm. And maybe you've got a situation where there's been some hoops jumped through. Maybe there's been some compromises made in the estate plan for how the non-farm kids are treated, because everybody agrees that we want that farm to continue. Now, what happens if 5 years in, 10 years in, what happens if that farming child says, land prices have sure appreciated. This isn't for me anymore. I'm going to cash out and capture that equity. Now, the first thing I'll say is that equity didn't get built in 5 or 10 years. There's a generation's worth of equity in that. And the fact that one individual might cash out and capture that and own that themselves could be an issue on that. So that's certainly something that I think people have concerns about in terms of how to address that. I've seen people talk about agreements or caveats that they might have to either share a portion of the sale proceeds, or contracts that dictate who they can sell to, or a set price, or a time frame. Even promissory notes attached to any gifts, just to kind of, again, you're affecting that the net equity value of it. If you hold that promissory note, you maybe don't call it until it's necessary to do so. Sweat equity, another tricky concept, and certainly something that gets brought up a lot. So what we're trying to do with that idea of sweat equity is capture how much that farming child has contributed over time without necessarily being paid maybe a fair market value wage. So there's a formula I put on here. It's a little bit, general, but to calculate it. So including cash that they have received through wages or salary. And then don't forget perks. So things like fuel, rent, maybe insurance or utilities. Heck, it might even, if they eat at home every night, it might even be food. So these are all elements of it, along with the equity, to kind of capture that. Now, one of the first things I will say about sweat equity is it's very difficult to calculate retroactively. So trying to go back and put numbers and values on this are tricky because numbers can be manipulated. And, when you're trying to either bolster whatever level of equity, it's pretty easy to go back and say, okay, this was worth a lot more. So that's one of the things I will say to anybody that is considering this. If you're at all at the outset of it, or if you've got time in front of you, sit down and try to figure out a way to record and to calculate that, because it'll help you out in the eventual times when you need to rely on that. Okay, transformational wealth. This one here, it's a good concept, but I'm going to first of all say I'm not positive it's super, super practical for a lot of operations. It tries to capitalize on this idea of the time value of money. So I didn't make up the term. I'm real good, and Alberta did. You can blame him. But I'm going to ask this question, and this is how I kind of explain the concept. Would you prefer to receive a chunk of cash in your 20s or a much larger amount in your 60s? And that's the idea behind it. Now, I've got lots of people that always say to me, they're like, yes, I'd rather have more money in my 60s. Okay, but if you really think about it, there's a lot of people out there that are like, you know, if I'm in my 20s, I might have student loans, I might have a mortgage or a down payment I need, I might have young children that I am supporting. And that chunk of cash would help me a lot then. It might transform my life. That's where the term comes from. And so again, versus if you get a much larger chunk of cash as part of an estate plan when your parents pass away, but you might be already in your 60s or maybe 70s. I mean, hopefully if your parents live a long life. So if you look at really the relative value and what you can do with that money, that's where this idea comes from. And that's the idea I want to introduce to incorporate into your thought process. Again, like what you're going to say, or you're already probably saying, practically speaking, a lot of farms, the cash flow is the problem, right? So it's not like you have tons of cash kicking around to be able to do this. But I like the idea of it, that there's maybe some opportunity to incorporate thoughts or ideas around that, even if you can't fully, lean into the idea. So I always like to bring it up, and I think it's kind of a little bit different take on it that people don't often think about. Okay. Estate planning with farm assets. This is probably where I spend a lot of time, because although it'd be ideal to do your estate plan with non-farm assets to support your non-farm kids in your estate plan, and then farm assets to go with your farm. That would be, heck, if I could ideally make an estate plan, that would be perfect. Again, not usually very common or practical in a farm, because a lot of that profit has been plunked right back into the farm over time, and it hasn't been spent on non-farm assets necessarily. So you do have situations where you're trying to consider what's fair, and really all you've got to play with are your farm assets. So now what you do need to think about with that is, I understand that might be the situation that you're in, but consider and think long-term about how peeling off any or some of those assets might affect the long-term viability of that existing operation. So maybe you could find some assets that aren't critical and that don't have a big effect. But if you do end up having to slice it up a little bit, very much don't lose track of the idea of access for that farming child. Because if reliance on that land that you are going to will to a non-farm sibling, if that farming operation is reliant on access to that, how can you put something in place to secure that? So it might be long-term rental agreements, might be right of first refusal, things like that, but consider access and how to deal with that. Now, the last one, I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, I've seen it a few times, this idea of a golden child syndrome, right? So the idea that there might be somebody in your family that might be the farming child that is the golden child. And the perception is that he's had everything handed to him, life given to him on a silver spoon. And that's that family perception. And so what do you do with that? Now, so what I'm going to suggest is consider selling some land to a farming child. It could be at a discount or a highly subsidized price, but you can actually tackle some of those fairness concerns, because then it's like, well, then everyone understands, well, he actually had to pay for some of the things that he received. He wasn't gifted everything. Plus, it does double duty, because if he does pay for some of it, you can actually use those funds to fund an estate plan for the non-farm kids. So there's a little bit of a two birds, one stone there. And again, I don't think anyone's going to argue with me. If you buy a 5,000 acre farm and you get it for the cost of 1,000 acres, that's a good deal on any day in any province. So something to consider on that, just to, because again, you can worry about the numbers, but you also have to worry about those relationships and what's going on in the background, and that can be one that brews if you don't acknowledge it. Okay, how are we doing for time? Yes, we are going to hurry through these last couple. Is there enough farm to go around? So we mentioned this in the first slide, knowing your retirement income needs. That's important. but it's also really important to understand your farm's current level of profitability. Does that farm make enough to support your needs in retirement and the incoming generation? So I don't want to shake anybody here, but a farm doesn't magically make more money because somebody else returns to it, because a family member returns to the farm. And I think that that's an important consideration. And I'm not saying people don't know that, but I think there's a little bit of this belief that, oh, if my family comes back, you know, there's going to be enough to go around. Well, it's, again, I hate to shake anybody, math. It's ultimately it's math to determine, okay, what does it make? What do we need? Is there enough to go around? Now, sometimes math can freak people out. So there are resources, I think that there are ways to help with this. So check with people like your banker who might be able to help with this, your accountant, financial advisors, independent consultants, because really what you're doing is you're calculating the excess cash on the farm and seeing if there's enough to go around for all the needs that you have. Now, the other thing that you can consider is if you're maybe early enough, what kind of adjustments can you make? So expansion opportunities, which is a pretty obvious one that I think people default to. So if you could do that, you're early enough. But again, this isn't something that should totally fall on that senior generation. So I've seen, you know, that next generation comes in and they create their own expansion or their own diversification. And maybe that's a custom work business, some kind of a side hustle, maybe like a seed cleaner, or maybe they simply look at improving the efficiency. They come and they bring that knowledge and expertise that, you know, they can get in and look at getting more return on the same assets. So there's ways to consider it if you don't have enough just on the first initial calculation, something to consider on that front there. Okay, so last slide with information on it. Transition tow ropes. So this is a little bit on what kinds of strategies and tools are available that you'll hear about that you could consider. So now we're into the implementation section. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the mechanics of these because this is probably you're going to get into your accountants and lawyers in implementing these and making them happen. But I think it's important I like to put them on one page so people realize, okay, there's quite a few tools in front of you. So the estate freeze, I referred to it earlier in the presentation. I'll kind of quickly explain it. It really is a tool to use with a company. So it's also called a share freeze. So you need to have company shares for it to work. And how, and again, quick and dirty explanation. So don't repeat this to your accountant. He'll probably tell you it's not nearly half as it's, I oversimplified it, but nevertheless to understand it. So you shares in a company, your company is valued as of a certain point in time. So net value. So all the assets, all the debt, net value of that company at a certain point in time that mom and dad are the shareholders of. That value, I think of it as an IOU. It technically is allocated back to mom and dad as preferred shares. So you'll hear it talked about preferred shares. Some people get really fancy and call it pref shares. It's really good. But if you think of it as an IOU, I think it helps with the concept of it. Then the next generation comes in and is allocated common shares or growth shares. So they have ownership in the company, but there's no value in those shares because all the value is tied up in the IOU that mom and dad hold with the preferred shares. But as the freeze term implies, mom and dad shares don't grow. So any profit that farm company continues to make, any income, that is now allocated to the common shares or the growth shares. And as that profit grows, they're able to redeem mom and dad's IOU. So that does a couple things, right? So it provides a retirement income for mom and dad from the redemption of those shares and allows the junior generation to buy out and buy more shares and therefore more ownership in that company. So it's pretty, now if you'll notice, I didn't mention borrowing money anywhere. There's no interest on that. So that's really why this is a very popular and very useful tool in transitions. You've got lots of flexibility. You've got lots of opportunity to make changes accordingly, depending on what kind of cash flow you can support. So it's really super popular. I see it a lot, and that's why it's one of the ones I wanted to, again, do the quick and dirty explanation on so you had a rough idea. Now, the other ones I'm not going to spend as much time on. You all know what land rental and land or share sales, discounted sales, gifts. Transition loan, I'll talk about. This is a shameless plug for FCC. That is an FCC product, but it is a good loan, especially when you're looking at non-arm's length sales. So what it allows for is the loan funds are dispersed to the vendor or the seller, mom and dad, over time, so up to 5 years. So if mom and dad don't mind getting the money over time, it can result in a huge interest saving for that junior generation. And that's one of the reasons why it's popular. It can be beneficial or not to the parents if you receive those funds over time. So again, I always leave that to an accountant to discuss the full consequences. The last thing I probably would say on this is that a combination of all of the above is really a good thing to consider. You don't have to use all of them, but maybe use one or two, or combine them. And the idea is back to this risk management. If your only source of income in retirement is the ongoing profit of that farm operation, that's riskier than it is if you're getting an income from some land rental, or you've got a nest egg from you sold a quarter. So that's all I'm saying, is that if you can diversify your risk a little bit and use different tactics, it can make for a much easier, I would say, transition, rather than being fully reliant on one big sale that's going to fund your entire retirement. So anyway, I think I will wrap it up there. It's like 10 minutes left for questions, so I'm hoping there's some, but if there aren't, that everybody gets to be done a little bit earlier. There is my contact information, phone number, and email. Yeah, I'll wrap it up there.
Perfect. Thank you, Val. That was a great presentation. And so we've got, like Val mentioned, about 10 minutes left to take some questions. And so please type your questions in the question box on the bottom right-hand side of the control panel. And if there's some questions in there that we don't get to in the next 10 minutes, then we'll ask Val to answer them either in the chat or else follow them up via an email. And so we don't have any questions in there right now, but I did have a question actually, as for when it starts, or in the meantime. So what do you suggest, like do you provide suggestions to families as to how do they start that conversation with each other, or
No, I'll actually sit with them. And we'll have the conversation. So again, that might take a couple forms. So in the case of sometimes do individual conversations with the farming son and and his wife, and then maybe mom and dad. And so that was a simpler one. If there's a couple farming kids, we'll do more than one conversation. But sit down and talk with them, and then circle back around and often have a full family conversation. Now, that isn't always necessary, but if when I had those individual conversations, I find out there's more going on here that everybody isn't necessarily aware of, I don't like the idea of ambushing anybody with that information. So we'll try to, share some information about it so people can think on it, and then we'll sit down and I can facilitate those, which is a little bit, I'm sure you can appreciate. If I ask a question as a stranger in this family, it might seem logical. Yeah, she doesn't know, she's asking. If a daughter-in-law asks the same question, not necessarily viewed the same way. So I think that's some of the value that any third party or a facilitator can bring to those. And yeah, so I will actually have those conversations. I won't, usually we stop it there. I don't write a formal plan, and I won't carry people on to the next stage. I'll set out, here's some things that I think would be good next steps to get you going. And then hopefully that bridges them to the technical advisors, the lawyers, and the accountants next.
Okay, that kind of maybe answers my follow-up question, because it's succession planning is a continuous process, right?
Yes.
Like you can start, when you first start your operation, and then as your kids or family members or other people come into it, and then as you age retirement kind of thing. And so then do you follow them through, or is it like you give them the starter and then they take it to kind of where
no, we don't follow. So we're a free service. So we kind of draw the line there, because when you get to that point where you are following somebody through, that's there are plenty of succession planners out there, great consultants and advisors. They do this for a living, and we are not trying to upset that apple cart. And I have no intention of taking that business with a free service, right? So I just want to encourage people to get started on that. So if somebody thinks that, this is great, this is a good little first step, but I think I need somebody to hold me accountable and to kind of carry me through this, then I will absolutely, I know plenty, and I'll give you options. I won't just send you one. I'll give you options of people to consider that could take you through the whole process. But what the idea is, the hope is that we're spurring that on. We give people enough that maybe they dispel any fear that's holding them back. They're like, okay, this isn't as bad as I thought. Or it gives them a couple first steps, gives them some knowledge so they don't come in like, oh, I didn't know anything about it. Now they know a little bit, but that's the idea, is to I hope, kind of trigger that first step. And again, not ending up being the people that do that. Again, we're a free service, so getting that first initial discussion and some questions, getting the ball rolling, and then hopefully you move on to those professionals that can take you the rest of the way.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think those are the questions that I have, and we
Awesome.
didn't have any more questions in the question box as of yet.
Okay.
So maybe for now, I'll say thanks for everybody online for joining us for this session. It was number 3 of our fall webinar series, and a huge thank you to you, Val, for your presentation and for answering the questions that we had. For everyone else that's listening, there's going to be one more session on November 8th. And so if you have any other questions regarding this topic, sometimes it takes us a while to think of questions. I get it. That's me too. And an hour later, I'll be thinking of some more questions for Val. If you have any questions regarding this topic or other agriculture-related questions or inquiries, please contact your nearest Saskatchewan Agriculture Regional office. We've got 10 throughout the province. Or if you don't know which one that is, just call the Ag Knowledge Center at 1-866-457-2377. Maybe I'll say that number again because I do talk fast. 1-866-457-2377, and they will direct you to your local specialist, or you can visit our website at saskatchewan.ca/agriculture. And so thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks, Val, and everyone have a great afternoon. Go enjoy some of the candy.
Hey, Natasha, there is one question that kind of,
Val, are you still on with us? Okay, we did have one more question, but we'll get Val to follow up with that after the event.
You bet. Thanks, Natasha. I'm just making sure I have written down who